Part 1. The Girl, the Bird, and the Demon. Chapter 1. The Abandoned Village of Nihaoi. Long ago, in the noble realm of Awara, where all creation, from the tallest peaks to the lowliest beetles, had forms both humble and divine, there lived an unremarkable girl named Otori Miyuko, the daughter of the innkeeper at the only remaining guest house in the village of Nihaoi. Miyuko was average by every conceivable standard: beauty, intelligence, the circumference of her hips, except for one. She was uncommonly loud. Once, when she was 2 years old, her mother was wrestling her into one of the inn's cedar tubs when Miyuko, who had no plans for a bath that day, screamed so violently that the foundations shook. The bells rang in the nearby temple, and a respectable chunk of the dilapidated bridge spanning the river a full quarter-mile away let out a horrified groan and slid, fainting, into the water. This was mere coincidence. Miyuko had not, in fact, been the cause of an earthquake. At least, not in this instance. But several of the priests, upon hearing her peculiar vocal faculties, rushed to exorcise her all the same. No matter what spells they chanted or incense they burned, however, they were ultimately disappointed to discover that she was not, in fact, possessed. Instead of a demon, what her parents had on their hands was merely a loud child. Worse, a loud girl. Among other things, girls of the serving class, and indeed girls of all stations in Awara, were expected to be soft-spoken, well-mannered, comely, charming, obedient, graceful, pliable, modest, helpful, helpless, and in every respect weaker and more feeble-minded than men. Unfortunately for Miyuko, she had very few of these qualities, and as a result, by the time she was 17, she had discovered that she was not only able to frighten off a man with the power of her voice alone, but she had also regrettable inclinations towards spilling tea upon her guests, kicking accidental holes in the rice paper screens, and speaking her mind, whether or not she was invited to do so. Her father, Rohiro, had the good grace never to say it, and by the time it mattered, her mother had long ago deserted them both. But Miyuko knew it was her duty as an only daughter to attract a husband, bear a son, and secure her father's legacy by passing on the family in to future generations. Over the years, she had learned to hide her opinions behind her smile, and her expressions behind her sleeves. But despite her best efforts, she was ill-suited to being a girl of the serving class. She was simply too visible, and frankly, that made her unappealing, both as a servant and as a woman. With few prospects, then, Miyuko devoted her days to the upkeep of her father's inn. Like the rest of Nihaoi, the guest house was failing. The roof was in need of thatching, the straw mats were in need of mending. She and Rohiro repaired what they could, and if they couldn't repair it, they went without it. All in all, it was a quiet life, and Miyuko was not, or so she told herself, unsatisfied. Everything changed, however, the day she dropped the last teacup. It was a late August afternoon, and nothing out of the ordinary was afoot. In the village temple, the priests sat cross-legged and meditated, to varying degrees of success, upon the order of the cosmos. In the tea-house, the proprietor weighed dried jasmine against brass units shaped like emperor butterflies. At the end, a teacup slipped from Miyuko's fingers as she was putting it away, and was dashed to pieces upon the floor. Miyuko sighed. Over the years, she'd damaged every single cup in the set. There were the ones she'd dropped, the ones she'd cracked as she cleaned them, the ones she'd cantered across the courtyard stones, pretending they were ponies. But that was 10 years ago. Being ceramic, the teacups were nervous by nature, but Miyuko's clumsiness had so increased their anxiety that it seemed that all she had to do was look at them and they'd shatter. Given that the only remaining cups were either chipped or seamed with glue, Rohiro determined that it was finally time to replace them. Ordinarily, he would have walked the mile to the potter's himself, but as he was currently nursing a broken foot, it was decided that he would remain at the inn to serve the only guest they'd had all week, a misanthropic silkworm farmer with one arm, while Miyuko was dispatched to retrieve the teacups. Taking an umbrella, she stepped eagerly out of the guest house. As a girl, she was supposed to be accompanied in public by a male relative at all times, but due to her mother's absence, In the deteriorating state of the inn, her father was admittedly lax on this custom, so Miyuko had, in the past, been allowed to collect tea from the tea house or eggs from one of the remaining farmers. Such errands, however, had always been confined to the village, and the prospect of venturing as far away as the kiln, well beyond Nihaoi's borders, filled her with a giddiness that she could not suppress. Rohiro, a handsome, broad-shouldered man, watched Miyuko from the doorway. Her mother used to say that Otori Rohiro was more beautiful than a man from a failing village had any right to be, and she'd often say it while threading her fingers through his thick black hair or counting the laugh wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. Not that Miyuko remembered it very clearly. "The potter won't like it," Rohiro muttered worriedly. In Miyuko's opinion, her father's habitual muttering somewhat mitigated the effects of his good looks, for she thought it made him seem older than his 43 years. He'd lost half his hearing as a child while swimming in the Azotso River, when an eager Geriigi sucked it from his skull like a yolk from an egg, giving him a poor sense of how loudly or softly he was speaking. "Won't like what?" Miyuko asked. "The fact that we won't be able to pay him until the silkworm farmer checks out, or the fact that I'm a girl, without a man to escort her?" "Both." She shrugged. "He'll just have to cope." "You sound like your mother." Her father's smile turned languid, the way it always did when he was thinking of his wife, beautiful by all accounts, but completely unable to be brought to heel. "You're getting to be more like her every day." In spite of herself, Miyuko grimaced. "Gods forbid!" He frowned, though. His eyes were too soft for it. Instead of looking angry, as other fathers might, his frown only made him appear sad, or, at best, quietly disappointed, which everyone knew was infinitely worse. "You could turn into worse things than your mother, you know," he said. "Certainly." The words flew from her mouth before she could stop them. "I could turn into a demon." Her father stilled, his face etched in sadness. Inwardly, Miyuko cursed her recalcitrant tongue. Sometimes, contrary to the conclusions of the priests, she was certain she was possessed, for no other girls she knew spouted off with every comment that popped into their heads. "I'm sorry, father." She bowed deeply, for loud and, willful as she was, she had no desire to cause her father pain. "Please forgive me." With a sigh, he leaned over, kissing the crown of her head, the same way he'd done since she was a baby. "You're my only daughter. All is already forgiven." She glanced up at him wryly. "And if you had another daughter, would you be quicker to hold a grudge?" Chuckling, he nudged her towards the old road. "Off with you now, and be quick. No one is safe at the verge hour." She traipsed into the front garden, nearly clipping the camellia bushes with the tip of her umbrella. "Dusk is more than an hour away," she said. "Best not to chance it," he replied. "My great-uncle's cousin once knew a warrior who got caught out at sunset and came home with his head on backwards." "What?" Miyuko laughed. Rohiro shook his head. It was terrible. First his wife left him. Then he broke both his legs trying to chase after her. Finally, he tried to cut his own throat. Only he couldn't get the angle right. It occurred to Miyuko that the wife's departure should have told the husband quite clearly that she did not want to be pursued. But Miyuko knew her father well enough to know that he'd just tell her she was missing the point. The point, of course, was this. It was safest to be within human borders at dawn and dusk, when the veil between Ada and Anna, the worlds of the mortal and the spirit, was thinnest. Miyuko's mother had always been particularly wary of the verge hours, for it was during these times that demons attacked travelers for their unctuous, buttery livers, ghouls appeared in mirrors to steal human faces, and ghosts slipped from doorways to wring the necks of unsuspecting passers-by underneath. So superstitious had Miyuko's mother been that she would refuse to cross a threshold during sunrise or sunset. She'd kept spirit dolls upon the rafters, written blessings for the spiders weaving in the bathtubs, left crushed eggshells for the Tachanagri living in the guest house walls. Then again, she'd also stolen a horse and ridden off into the gloaming one evening, while she was supposed to be fetching water for the dinner kettle, leaving Miyuko, age 9, and her father at the table, watching their rice grow cold. Since her mother had chosen braving the twilight hour over spending another second with her family, Miyuko suspected, with some bitterness, that perhaps her mother hadn't been so superstitious after all. I'll be back before sunset, Miyuko assured her father. With all the teacups intact? No promises. Bowing again, she left the front garden and set off through the village with a bounce in her step. She passed vacant shops and crumbling homes, noting the doors coming out of their tracks and the mice scurrying through clefts in the foundation like violet luck sprites. To anyone else, the appearance of the village might have been cause for alarm, but to Miyuko, who had only ever known such deterioration, it was beautiful in its ordinariness. The sigh of floorboards sinking into the ground, the slow creep of vines pulling down a wall. Through the center of the village, Miyuko trotted down the beaten gravel path known as the Old Road, which had in years past served the primary route into Udaiwa, the capital of Awara. In ancient times, Nihaoi, only a half-day's journey from the city, had catered to travelers of every stripe. Noblemen and their vassals, lecherous monks, beggars, circus troupes that boasted choleric fortune-tellers and dancing raccoon spirits, and, on at least 4 occasions, unmarried women. Nearly 300 years ago, in the aftermath of the Five Swords era, the then Yotokai, Awara's highest-ranking military officer, second only to the emperor himself in authority, and, for all intents and purposes, the actual ruling sovereign, had ordered the construction of the great highways to unify the realm. In the centuries since, traffic on the old road had dwindled, and Nihaoi had entered a sustained period of decline. Taverns closed, stables, cobblers, and merchants forced out of business, farmers leaving their fields to fallow and rot. Government emissaries, who had once been wealthy and complacent in their fine pavilions, all removed to other promising posts. Since then, nothing in Nihaoi had gone untouched by decay. Not the smattering of shops, or the temple, home to 4 lugubrious priests, not even the spirit gate, which marked the edge of the village. Generations of insects had left tunnels along the pillars, forming twisting labyrinths beneath the flanking vermilion paint. Lichens clung to the joists. The engravings, meant to be repainted every year with sacred indigo ink to renew their protective magic, had faded to a faint and ineffective hue. Though she tried not to, Miyuko could not help but think of her mother as she approached the gate. It had made quite a scandal for the tiny village, even sparking rumors that Otori Rohiro's wife was in fact a Tskegaira, a spirit wife, who took human form to lure mortals into marriage. Although she did not believe in such things per se, Miyuko could not help but think that there had been indeed something odd and wild about her mother, something that now rushed through Miyuko's veins like a brisk stream or a southern wind. Despite herself, then, she could not help but wonder how her mother had looked astride that stolen horse, its mane and tail the same flowing dark as a river at night. Had her mother glanced back even once, her oval face pale as the moon, before charging off into the wild blue countryside like a warrior from some ancient tale or a queen of shadow and starlight. How melodramatic! Annoyed at herself, Miyuko kicked at a stone, sending it clattering into a nearby boulder with a clack that echoed throughout the ruined village. It didn't matter how her mother had looked. If she'd hesitated or not, for the end result was the same. She'd left. Miyuko and her father had been abandoned, just like the rest of Nihaoi. The borders had already been tightened once since Miyuko's mother had left, as businesses failed and families departed in search of more prosperous circumstances, but the potter had steadfastly refused to relocate, for both he and his wife claimed that the spirit of their dead son still haunted the kiln. Perhaps the boy broke the occasional vase or ceremonial urn, but on the whole, he remained a chatty, good-natured child, and none of them were prepared to sacrifice their happy family for something as frivolous as safety. In general, the situation was of little inconvenience, for in daylight, a mile on the old road, which hadn't the traffic to attract unsavory types such as highwaymen and ravening monsters, was hardly dangerous. In fact, Miyuko rather enjoyed the opportunity to stretch her legs, and with about an hour left before dusk, she had no reason for concern. Leaving the gate behind her, Miyuko walked cheerily along the old road as it wound through the abandoned fields. During the Five Swords era, these plains had been the site of a great battle. When the powerful Ogawa clan had ridden upon Udaiwa, stronghold of their emissaries, the Omens, and were massacred on the fields. When she was a child, Miyuko had longed to dig among the furrows with the boys her age, unearthing rusted arrow points and scraps of lamellar armor. But propriety had forbidden it, and after hearing a number of harrowing tales about warrior ghosts rising from the earth, she decided that perhaps it was better if she played inside instead. Swinging her umbrella, Miyuko picked her way across the dilapidated bridge that spanned the Ozotsu River, an emerald serpent that hissed and glittered along its steep banks as it meandered towards the capital. Once, the bridge had been broad enough for 2 carriages to comfortably pass, but the earthquake that had accompanied Miyuko's infamous tantrum had put an end to that. Now, with its half-rotted beams and a gaping hole on the downriver side, the bridge was scarcely wide enough for a single horse. As she crossed, a lone magpie winged across the sky, clutching a golden medallion in its beak. It was an ill omen which Miyuko did not see. Then, among the weeds in the overgrown ditches, an insect chirped 11 times and stopped. A portent of misfortune which Miyuko did not hear. Finally, a chill wind gusted over the empty fields, shuffling the dead leaves in Miyuko's path to spell out a message of doom. Perhaps if she paid more attention to her mother's stories, Miyuko would have known that, in advance of some terrible calamity, the world would often be filled with warnings and opportunities to change one's fate. But she did not like stories, and, since her mother's abrupt departure, had gone out of her way to avoid them. So she did not see the signs, or, if she did, she told herself they meant nothing. She was a straightforward girl with her head squarely on her shoulders, too sensible to be concerned with anything more than the look of the clouds, which appeared as if they were breaking up anyway. If she had been paying more attention, perhaps she could have saved herself a great deal of trouble by promptly turning back the way she had come, although, unbeknownst to her, doing so would have had an equal chance of bringing about a cataclysm so swift and absolute that not even the abandoned village of Nihaoi would be spared. Either way, she continued walking.